You can support this project by subscribing on Spotify for £3 a month.
You are listening to the Nostalgia Podcast with myself, Brian Scarf, and my friend and co-host, Sebastian Morello. And this week we are joined by the Raw Egg Nationalist, who is the founder of Man's World magazine, an advocate for the humane treatment of animals and localist food production. He is also the author of a number of works, including The Eggs Benedict Option and the upcoming The Last Men, Liberalism and the Death of Masculinity. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to join you both. Looking forward to it.
Thanks so much for being on.
It's a pleasure.
It first occurred to me that it would be interesting to talk to you when I read your piece called "A Vitalist Christianity, Don't Bet on It" in the first edition of Man's World that went properly physical. And I thought there was a lot to think about there and a lot to talk about. Perhaps could you give the listeners an overview of what you were writing in that essay and sort of the background why you were interested in the question in the first place?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I suppose it's probably best to start with the background. I mean, I have a PhD in medieval history from Oxford, DPhil, in medieval history. I wrote about the Reformation. So that's the Great Schism that happened sort of beginning in the early 16th century in Western Christianity, that resulted in the formation of the Catholic Church as we know it now and the Protestant churches in various different denominations, Lutheran, Reformed, etc. So, I mean, I have a pretty deep background in religious history and a personal interest in religion as well, the fate of religion. But the essay itself was about attempts to reconcile Christianity with a kind of Nietzschean philosophy. So on the right, you've got people like Bronze Age Pervert, for example, who's been very influential, wrote Bronze Age Mindset, this kind of samizdat work of philosophy that came out in, I think, 2018, 2017, and has been hugely influential on the new right, making its way to the White House. It's been a big influence on me as well. And you get people who I think quite naively try and reconcile this kind of Nietzschean classical kind of worldview that Bronze Age Pervert espouses, return to the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks, with Christianity. And you have people saying things like, oh, well, you know, Hernan Cortez was a Christian, so there's no reason why we can't have a vitalist Christianity, a Christianity that is muscular, that is rooted in the body, in physicality, that pursues things like glory and is kind of maybe even militaristic. And the essay really is my attempt to say, well, actually, this is kind of naive, really. It's kind of a bit stupid. It's ahistorical. It doesn't understand the circumstances of Christian history, really. I mean, it's quite complicated. We can get into the thickets if we want to, but that's the basic thrust of the essay, is that actually reconciling Christianity with this sort of vitalist right-wing kind of insurgency, if you will, whatever you want to call it, is a bit of a fool's errand, I think.
Do you think that there is a different animating spirit to men like Cortez, and maybe more recently, you obviously have organizations like the Romanian Iron Guard. You have in Mexico the Cristeros, and in Lebanon various Christian militia groups, it seems that there's definitely at least a space for the expressions of masculine virtues to the point of the use of force in some ways to repress evil. But do you think that these come from kind of a very different genealogy from the Nietzschean right? And is there?
I think it's very complicated. I mean, you have to, if you want to understand people like historical figures, I think like Hernán Cortés and the barbarian kings, who came after the fall of Rome and were converted to Christianity and were the sort of early bulwarks against the expansion of Islam, for example, into Europe. I think that you can't understand them apart from the historical context, which is the historical context of the church, which is that the church was under assault, and the church needed men like Alaric, and even later men like Hernán Cortés to protect it. I mean, the church had a vested interest in a different kind of vested interest, I think, in temporal power than it has now necessarily. I think there's probably always going to be a space for people like that, or certainly for expressions of physical power. But fundamentally, I think the church is a different organization than it was. I mean, the church is all in on the Great Replacement, for example. The church is all in on replacement migration, and the Catholic Church and Protestant churches are all banking their future actually on the global south. So, I mean, population growth and also religious growth of, religious affiliation is all in the global south, So you've got the Catholic Church, you've got the Protestant churches all looking to Africa, to Latin America, to Asia for their growth. And so they've ceased to be in any kind of meaningful sense, I think, a guardians of Europe's inheritance, guardians of European identity in a way that they were before. So it's a complicated thing. I mean, really, what I was pushing back against was just people trying to say that, oh yeah, you can be a Christian and you can also be like a warrior in any kind of easy sense. I mean, there are always, and you look at the Bible, you look at you're always going to the central message of Christianity, the central symbols and stories. You're always going to find things that push back against any attempt to root Christianity in the body, in the physical, in let's say glorification of the body, glorification of the physical, anything like that. The central symbol of Christianity is God nailed to a cross, dying. And so
can I perhaps sort of try and throw a spanner in the works here and see if this helps at all? Because I think there is a very important distinction here that isn't being entertained, which is that when you use the word church, you seem to use that term to denote specifically the hierarchy. But the church traditionally simply meant the baptized, right? Sure. And the church was divided into the clerical hierarchy and the laity, and the clerical hierarchy was numerically tiny compared to the great body of the faithful, as it were. And you have that dialogue in the Garden of Gethsemane when Christ asks Peter how many swords he has, and he says, "I have two." And when Peter actually draws the sword of coercion, he's basically criticized by Christ, and he's told to put the sword away. And what Pope Saint Gelasius says in the letter Unum Sunt, Duo Sunt, to Emperor Anastasius the First, is he says this is basically because the clerical hierarchy cannot wield the coercive sword directly. That is for the faithful. And so that early on in the church's history, there's this notion that whilst the clerical hierarchy, the priesthood, cannot take on the role of warrior Christians, that very much does belong to the laity. and out of that you get the whole tradition of the Knights and the Crusaders and the Templars and all of that kind of thing. And of course, the people that you've mentioned so far, people like Cortez or Alaric or, Otto the Third, the emperor plundering Rome and so on, these people are all laity. They're all laity. And so it seems to me that if we are going to talk about the possibility of a vitalist Christianity, it's not really appropriate to focus on the clerical hierarchy, because there is no tradition of trying to root that in the clerical hierarchy. It's kind of a calling of lay men.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I suppose really the focus in the essay actually is on the church, is on the organized church, is on the hierarchy and the problems with the organized hierarchy. I mean, yeah. My fundamental point, I suppose, is just that the organized hierarchy doesn't have any taste for it anymore in a way that it perhaps did before. The voyages of Christopher Columbus, to the New World. I mean, they had the blessing of the papacy. The papacy carved up the world. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, between the New World, between the Spanish and the Portuguese. I think
what I'm saying here is that whilst the clerical hierarchy often gave its endorsement to the secular arm, to the laity, to the coercive power of the church, that wasn't always the case. And in fact, in the case of Otto III, he turned the temporal sword of the church against the Pope and went and plundered Rome and kicked out the Pope.
Of course.
And sometimes I wonder whether the laity of the church should be doing that with their hierarchy, sort of going and giving them a good kicking about. And that it belongs to the laity of the church to rediscover that kind of chivalric masculine tradition, which I don't entirely agree with you that that's not biblical, because in the end, whilst you do have Christ nailed to a cross, it's also a story of a God becoming embodied, incarnate, working with his hands, being a carpenter.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's the case that there's no material there in Christianity for it, because there obviously is, because you wouldn't have had figures like Hernán Cortés, and also you wouldn't have had, you've got biblical figures, King David, etc. It's just that there's no easy interpretation, I think, of Christianity in kind of vitalist terms. You're always going to get contradictory interpretations. Which I suppose is true of any religious tradition. I mean, there's no single interpretation of the Buddhist tradition or single interpretation of Islam or anything like that. I suppose really what I'm just pushing back against is people who think that there's a very easy way just to say you can have a vitalist Christianity, we can have a revival of kind of muscular Christianity, and that it will be that it would, the dissident right, the so-called dissident right, which I'm sort of a part of, supposedly, is, this is it's kind of like the cutting edge of the right, and it's very popular. It has a popular appeal. It has a popular appeal with young men, and I think they get to thinking that maybe this is the way that Christianity kind of fights back. This is the way that we make Christianity more relevant for young people and give it a kind of broader appeal is to make it sort of vitalist. And my criticism is just that, well, I think that you're going to have a hard time convincing the church hierarchy. Certainly you're going to, at best, maybe you could have some kind of lay movement perhaps, but you're not going to convince the hierarchy, I don't think, because the hierarchy's gone all in on the spirit of the age.
Totally, yeah.
So.
No, yeah. That's obviously true. Although I don't think it was that obvious a couple of hundred years ago.
No.
That the hierarchy was going to go all in with liberalism and progressivism and globalism. There was nothing about the old-fashioned clerics of the 19th century that suggested it was going to go in that direction. So I don't think history really has a direction in that sense. I think there is an imperative among lay Christians to recover a sense of the kind of, militant character of the Christian tradition, at least how it's manifested itself in different ways. And if the church needs to do anything in order to recover its authentic tradition, it needs to basically de-gay itself or ungay itself, essentially. And it seems like, strong Christian men having large families and taking seriously their health, eating a lot of the stuff that you promote, eating real food, doing real exercise. I'm a huge advocate of Garda training and mace training and things like that.
Nice.
Because I actually, when I exercise with maces, I feel like a warrior. Basically, I feel like a warrior training, and so anyway, I really believe I think we underestimate how amazing it is that in Christian history, this weird amalgamation that no one could have predicted of the monk and the knight in these crusaders, these people who took vows and just went into unknown deserts, just to kind of give themselves in defense of the church and pilgrim routes and so on. It's kind of something incredibly embodied and masculine and terrifying about these men who did these things. And recovering that spirit would be a very good thing, it seems to me. But anyway. I don't want to hijack the conversation. Sorry.
No, interesting. I was going to say, one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about this conversation is that while we've discussed the problems with the church hierarchy, in some ways there's a similar problem, sort of an inverted mirror problem to the Nietzschean position of trying to go back to a classical antiquity.
Yeah,
is that the consciences of modern, even Nietzscheans, are Christian, and perhaps even to those who are most hostile to Christianity, they would, if really pressed, think that that's probably a good thing, because I'm not sure that anyone is really advocating to go back to the kind of brutality and rapine that you might see in people who'd have the kind of worldview that maybe Tom Holland has done a really good job of demonstrating the pre-Christians having no qualms about committing utterly desolate acts against children. So in some ways we're kind of stuck with each other. The Nietzscheans are breathing Christian air, and Christians kind of are suffering under a hierarchy that's totally drunk the Kool-Aid of liberalism. And we're both trying to negotiate, but an authenticity within our own traditions. But in some ways, it's always defined by the other's position to some degree.
Well, I think as well, part of the problem is with these kind of a lot of these sort of dissident right types who advocate for, let's say, like a vitalist Christianity, is I don't think they've read any Nietzsche either. And a lot of people who talk about Nietzsche actually haven't really read very much Nietzsche, and they would. I mean, Nietzsche, if you just read The Antichrist, then you are very liable to think that Nietzsche had a pathological hatred of Christianity. But Nietzsche said stuff like, for example, Nietzsche does call the arrival of Christianity a slave revolt in morality, but he also said that actually it was beneficial in many ways. I mean, one of the things that Nietzsche said, for example, was that the slave revolt in morality made man subtle in ways that he wasn't before. There's a great focus in Nietzsche's work on responsibility. And, he says it's necessary for man to become responsible in order for man to make promises. And he makes, including promises to himself. And that is actually what the overman is. The overman is man's promise to himself. It's not just the case that actually Nietzsche, I don't think that Nietzsche just wanted a return to Roman morality or ancient Greek morality. I mean, obviously he was a great admirer of those things, but I think he also realized that that Christianity presented man with new possibilities. Although there were bad things about the slave revolt in morality, the inversion of aristocratic values and things like that, nevertheless, it actually created new possibilities for man. And I mean, there are basic kind of technical problems, historiographical problems with the position too, the kind of naive position, because the only access that we have to classical texts is through Christianity. I mean, it was monks who preserved Christian texts. I mean, the texts that we have and the texts that we know about that existed but didn't survive. We owe all of that to Christian monks in particular. And we have this, great tradition of certainly beginning in like the 12th century with the kind of scholastic movement. We have this great tradition of interpretation of classical texts by Christian writers, and so you don't have unfiltered access to the classical past. You have to go through Christianity to get to the classical past. So there's no getting away from Christianity, I think. I mean, even if you wanted to get away from it, I don't think you can. You have to reckon with the Christian past. You have to reckon with the Christian inheritance, and that includes the very way that you think and the categories that you use. I mean, one of the, I am basically having studied the Reformation. I did PhD on the Reformation. I'm in absolutely no doubt that the Reformation is the defining event of the modern era. And I think it's impossible. It's impossible not, if you're asking big questions about modernity, about modern life, about why we are the way we are, why we think the way we think, why we have the particular problems that we have. You have to reckon with the Reformation. You have to reckon with the kind of changes that came out of the Reformation. You can't talk about liberalism without talking about the Reformation. It's so yeah. I mean, I think I suppose really what that essay was a call for some subtlety and a call for actually a bit of scholarship. Actually, like it's very easy to make these pronouncements about returning to vitalist Christianity, returning to the spirit of the Reconquista or something. But actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that, I think.
It's I did read the works of Nietzsche when I was a postgraduate, and that was quite a few years ago. And I won't be able to give you any specific details, but I remember thinking at the time, particularly when I read The Genealogy of Morals, that whenever he was talking about Christianity, he was talking about a very, very specific kind of Christianity, which was basically kind of Southern German Lutheranism. And that's what he's really railing against. I think his father and his grandfather were Lutheran pastors, and I think the intention was for him to enter a Lutheran seminary and follow that family tradition. And I did. I'm a Roman Catholic Christian myself, and I did feel that a lot of the arguments he launched were not aimed at my religion or anything I meant by the practice of my religion. So do you think that his criticisms are more specifically of Reformation Christianity or of Christianity in general?
Yeah, quite probably. I mean, it's been a little while since I've really gone in depth on Nietzsche. I mean, I was big on Nietzsche in my early 20s, as a lot of young men are. There's a great lecture on YouTube by this chap called Rick Roderick from like the 1980s, and he said, every young man has a phase where he calls his car the Übermenschmobile or something like that. Like you start reading Nietzsche and you really kind of over-identify with certain aspects of his philosophy. It's a very seductive kind of philosophy, I think, especially for young men, sensitive young men. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure, I absolutely no doubt that Nietzsche's critique of Christianity is influenced by his particular particular circumstance. I mean, I'm sure there are elements of it that are definitely applicable to all forms of Christianity. And I mean, I think that his kind of genealogy of the guilty conscience is very interesting, which is a big part of the genealogy of morals. You know, I wrote an essay actually for American Mind probably last year, I think, about this chap Aaron Bushnell. Do you remember him, the guy who set himself on fire for Palestine?
Oh, right. Yeah.
So he was this American serviceman, and I think he was undergoing a real identity crisis. I think he thought he was transgender, and he decided to set himself on fire to protest events in Gaza, basically after October the 7th, and he was an active poster on Reddit, and I think that's part of the reason actually why he was kind of radicalized into doing what he did, and also into believing what he believed about himself was spending too much time on internet forums. But he had all of these posts on there, and you could trace like the development of his guilty conscience and the way that it kind of turned in on itself. And he came to believe that basically the only way that he could expiate the sin of being born white was to kill himself. And so I talked about this at length, and I think that there's a real there are definitely very, very penetrating insights, I think, in the genealogy of morals. There's stuff that very easily, I think, gets taken out of context and gets kind of bowdlerized and kind of barbarized a bit. But I think there are probably aspects of it that are relevant to all Christianity, and may even be relevant perhaps to religious attitudes more broadly, or religion as a kind of structure of feeling, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, very interesting. Certainly, at least, would you agree that it seems that the Reformation, particularly Lutheranism, was a great force for the introduction of egalitarianism into Europe, and that in some way pre-Reformation Christianity had maintained and baptized the notion of a kind of aristocratic excellence within society? I suppose I'm still thinking of the knights, but also just the fact that, you know, there was a hierarchical feudal society throughout most of Christian Europe, and the aristocratic ideal was meant to be the ideal for all of the Christian laity, I suppose.
I'm sure there are definitely, I think there's definitely some truth in that. Although it's worth remembering that, Luther. There was a Lutheran counter-reaction to movements like the Anabaptists in Munster. You know, the excesses of absolute levelling that took place in places like Munster and had to be put down by force by the secular authorities. You know, I mean, Luther really did. Really was quite disgusted by that, I think, and he, pushed back very hard against it. And I mean, I'm not a great expert on Lutheran doctrine, but I mean, if you look at England, then there's some interesting things to be said about England. So, I've been writing about post-liberalism, this kind of people like Patrick Deneen and stuff like that, and this kind of diagnosis, that the problems of America derive from liberalism as an ideology, and that they need, America needs to kind of get beyond liberalism and embrace aristopopulism, or whatever it is that Patrick Deneen calls it, this new kind of vision of collective virtue and a multiracial working class and all this kind of stuff. There's a very interesting book by a historian called Alan McFarlane called The Origins of English Individualism, and he makes the argument that the English were basically liberals, individualists, in quite a radical way. Right back in the kind of central Middle Ages, you have, if you actually look at the way that the English lived and behaved, then they were liberals. So they were living in truncated nuclear families. They had geographical mobility. They didn't look after their extended family very well, not even their own parents. There was a market economy. Love marriage was common. It was a common thing for ordinary English people to marry who they chose from a very early period. So you've got like this the kind of central aspects of what we would describe as kind of the liberal way of living were actually, were being embodied by English people long before John Locke or David Hume or whoever, any of the great kind of Adam Smith, any of the great figures of liberalism as ideology. So I think, I think you can talk about the difference between, let's say, medieval religion and post-Reformation religion, but I also think that there's something else too. And certainly, if you look at the case of England, then it looks like actually you've got liberalism was just the way that the kind of Germanics who lived in England lived. It's a complicated question. But I certainly think that a doctrine like justification by faith alone, that radically strikes at the heart of any kind of notion of hierarchy. And once that doctrine is actually once that cat is out of the bag, then you've got, various great theologians, great kind of figures in the Reformed churches and Lutheran churches trying to put it back in the bag because they realize actually, this can go, there's no limit to how far this doctrine can actually be pushed. And it can basically dissolve all forms of hierarchy. You might be Martin Luther and you think, we don't want the whore of Babylon in Rome to be presiding over us. We don't want that hierarchy, but we want some hierarchy. But then you get the Anabaptists who say, no, there should be no hierarchy at all. And, you only need to look at the proliferation of Protestant sects since the Reformation. It's like a perpetual motion machine almost, that doctrine just keeps creating new sects. And so, I think there probably is something to that. I think that the Reformation does set in train particular kind of changes within Christianity, yes, that give birth to I'd say like anti-hierarchical sentiments and anti-hierarchical movements. The Bible is anti-hierarchical in a sense, obviously. And when the peasants revolted in 1381, what did they say? When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? The vision of the Garden of Eden is made to serve. Of Adam and Eve in their innocence is made to serve, this radical, almost communist vision of English society where you have no gentleman. And that was 100+ years before the Reformation. So again, I think there are all kinds of different currents at work. But I think the Reformation nevertheless is a key moment, the creation of these new sects that kind of are justified by their faith alone rather than anything else.
That's interesting, really interesting.
Mm. With both groups both groups that we've been talking about, both sort of the right within the church, or just right-thinking people within the church, and the sort of Nietzschean dissident right, seemingly at the moment have almost entirely the same enemy group. So I think that's another reason why conversations like this need to happen, because
yes,
the right seems to be famous for its infighting. One of the reasons why it's never really been able to achieve anything at all up until the sort of very, very recent present. And yet it seems that in order to push back against the kind of zeitgeist, the tyranny of absolute liberalism, which homogenizes everything and flattens everything, that there needs to be a recognition of, at the very minimum, my enemy's enemy is my friend, yes. which I think is probably a very low bar. I think there's a lot more that we share in common. I think what we're seeing unfolding in America is an interesting example of this, because at the very top of the administration, you have men like J.D. Vance, you have Kennedy, Rubio, and I forget his name, the sort of tattooed evangelical with all the crusader marks all over his body.
Pete Hegseth.
Right, exactly, and he's in charge of the defense, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And so you've got kind of this, for want of a better word, quite muscular European expression of Christianity that's taking the reins. But the foot soldiers on the ground are walking around with Bronze Age pervert in their pockets, and so there is already a kind of marriage of similar goals emerging, and quite fruitfully. I think very, very few have anything to complain about of what's being achieved at the moment. So I don't know. I would like to see something like that emerge in Europe.
Yes,
because the church does have massive amounts of disaffected young men who, on the one hand, feel so deeply attached to the traditions of the faith and its metaphysics and its spiritual beliefs and teachings, but at the same time completely are separated from the vision of the hierarchy. And you also have sort of roaming groups of more dissident, less structured right-wing thinkers that in some ways are in need of a structure, are in need of this more civilizational element that the historic church can provide. And
a tradition that hasn't been ruptured. I mean, as you've made this point, if you really do want to get back to the great vitalism of the classical world, you're going to have to go through the church's tradition anyway, because that's your only source of contiguity, I suppose. So you know, in the end, you need a tradition that hasn't been ruptured.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of nonsensical to talk of Christian civilization, to talk of European or Western civilization from a secular perspective. I mean, if you're defending Western civilization, you are defending the church, you are defending the Christian inheritance, and like you say, the only direct continuity that we have with the Roman past is the Roman Catholic Church. You know, I mean, the Roman Catholic Church has preserved the institutional structure of the Roman Empire. You know, I mean, it was the the structure of the bishoprics of the Roman Empire that is preserved in the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church is the defender of the Latin inheritance, of the Latin language. So, yeah, I mean, I think what's going on in the US is interesting, and certainly this kind of, it's not an uneasy alliance, like you say. I think that actually it's an alliance that's working quite well so far, and there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of friction. I mean, you get some people who are sort of complaining about the dissident right and saying, you know, we shouldn't be making peace with these people, we shouldn't be making common cause with them, but actually they don't seem to be winning at the moment, and I think it's a good sign actually that both sides can be a bit pragmatic about this, because obviously what's at stake is enormous, and that's no less true in Europe. And I mean, the situation in Europe is slightly different in certain ways. I mean, I don't know that the demographic situation yet is quite as bad as it is in the US, but nevertheless, I mean, it's bad, and it's you know, getting worse quickly. The demographic situation in the UK is getting very bad very quickly. You know, things are changing. Things have changed enormously even since the beginning of the pandemic. You know, so certainly since sort of 2020, since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. So I think, I mean, I think now is obviously the time for pragmatic recognition of shared goals rather than differences. And I think the American example, yes, definitely has a lot to teach us in Europe. Not just Trump himself, but also actually the shape of the movement that has kind of coalesced beneath him and around him, and people like JD Vance. I mean, in America, they're in politics, then they're not quite as uneasy about Christianity as they are in Europe. That's a big difference. It's still a perfectly, normal thing for a politician to be a Christian in the US, whereas, say, in the UK, you have someone like, I think, Tim Farron, who was leading the Lib Democrats, and he was always basically having to apologize for the fact that he was a Christian. He was doing his very best not to scare people by saying that he was a Christian, and
that wasn't enough.
No, exactly. Yeah, that wasn't enough. That still made him kind of repellent to the electorate. So we face, I think, some different problems. But yes, there is obviously an enormous role that could be played by the church in politics, in revival of sort of Western civilization, in the revival of Europe. And it's a question, I suppose, of who's in charge and their priorities. I mean, certainly at the moment, I see the Catholic Church, and I have a lot of friends who are Catholics, and I have a couple of friends, very close Catholic friends, who are constantly trying to convert me. And I'm baptized Protestant. I'm baptized Church of England, which doesn't really mean anything. Of course, that's just like saying I'm just a human being or something. It's not any great sort of label of any kind of meaningful commitment or anything. But when I see the Catholic Church and I see headlines, about how, for example, cardinals and bishops are funneling money to the NGOs that are bringing migrants across the Mediterranean, and you see that the Pope Francis is best friends with one of the heads of these NGOs, Mediterranean, I think, and he took him to conclave or whatever. And it's very clear that at the moment, certainly, that the most prominent elements of the Catholic Church are basically arrayed against Europe rather than for it. And so I think there's going to have to be change at every single level. I think there'll have to be change on the grassroots level, I think, but there also has to be some kind of movement from within the hierarchical church, the organized church, to reverse these trends that are very much against European identity, against Europe's heritage, etc.
I don't think you're going to get any explicit defense of the current church's leadership on this podcast, so you don't need to worry about that. Do you think that something analogous to what's happened in America could unfold now this side of the pond, particularly in these isles? I mean, I spend a fair amount of time in pubs. I know you're not a big fan of grain products, but real ale is a great source of consolation to me. And and it's quite amazing if you sit in a pub, particularly if you're outside the M25, and you just eavesdrop on the conversations. Everyone is unhappy. Everyone thinks that they are living through national collapse. They are. Well, it's not. They think they know they are. They observe. Their eyes are open and they can observe it. And it does seem to me that if someone were to emerge who hadn't come through the parliamentary ranks and kind of like Trump, who was just who was kind of known for appearing on wrestling shows and was a businessman and appeared in what was it, Home Alone or whatever, you had these kind of little cameos. That's right. And then suddenly just appears out of nowhere and takes the whole thing by storm. It seems to me, I mean, it's not obvious to me that the way that England's constitution is structured with its particular political organs, something like that would even be possible. But nonetheless, it seems to me that is that there's a huge appetite for something like that in these isles, and a movement like that would require, it seems to me, a kind of a deep sympathy to emerge, albeit a pragmatic one, between the nascent dissident right and those who want to retrieve the distinct Christian character of this country. Because I don't think you don't have a United Kingdom without its Christian history. I know it's a complex Christian history, first with the Celtic Christianity and Latin Christianity, and then the Reformation, and then the established church and the dissenter traditions, and we even managed to fit in some regicide along the way, and all of this kind of, I know it's a very, but nonetheless, that all of that is still a Christian history. And it seems to me that that would need to be part of whatever the great movement to reclaim the nation. That would have to be part of it.
Yes, I think so. I mean, it's one of the interesting things about Trump, actually, is, Trump is a secular figure, right? Trump is the American dream in many respects. He's an embodiment of the American dream. He even has gold hair, and but he's certainly, I think, since the assassination attempts, the first assassination attempt, then he's actually become more overtly actually a Christian figure too. He's talked about his faith. He's talked about his belief that actually God preserved him for a purpose. So that's an interesting dynamic. I think the closest, obviously, that we have to Donald Trump at the moment, and I don't think he's that close really, is Nigel Farage. Because Nigel Farage has spent although he's been a politician and he's had a political career, he was in finance before, I think, worked in the city, and as a politician, he was an outsider politician in the sense that he wasn't an MP. He was the leader of a political party. And he was a member of a parliament, but it was the European Parliament rather than the the House of Commons. So yes, I think that there's obviously an enormous appetite, like you say. You've been in the pubs, you got your ear to the ground. You know how people feel, and I, when I walk around the local town, for example, I see it in people's faces. I've never seen people look so set. Virtually everybody just looks set upon. They look really, really miserable and really, 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 really broken down. I think the time is very obviously ripe, and we are living through a national collapse. I think it's people do know it. Yeah, like you say, people don't just think it, people know it. They know that the country really is going to the dogs now.
There's a paradox about Nigel Farage in that he's been the insurgent anti-establishment figure for decades now, and he's probably, it was never even conceivable to him that he would ever one day be possibly the prime minister, which has been so unbelievably beyond the pale to suggest it. And yet he is kind of staring at this as a serious possibility now, and seems to have completely lost his welly.
Yes.
Unable to confront the disastrous migration policy with any serious solutions. He's backpedaling, and so we're faced with this incredible paradox that the dissidents have maybe never been quite so close to power in this country, and yet the vehicle
so far away.
Exactly, the vehicle that's taking us there seems to be dismantling itself or doing everything it can to castrate any potency it might have.
It's funny. It seems to me like part of it is because some of it, I think, is Nigel Farage trying to ensure that he has full control of the party, I think. And so there are obviously elements within the party who have a different vision and who perhaps want harder messaging. And I think he's trying to bring people into line. I think that's part of it. And so what you're seeing a lot of this kind of internal jockeying for power actually kind of manifesting itself publicly. but yeah, it's strange. I mean, I don't fully understand why Farage isn't really seizing the moment and seizing the mood. I mean, surely he knows, surely he can see it, surely he understands that actually, you know, Reform and Farage himself and UKIP, you know, have been marketed for decades, for years, as an alternative to the corrupt, unrepresentative establishment, the Westminster system, etc. And now he just seems to be settling in to become an establishment politician himself, and he's done it. He's done it very, very comfortably too. You can see that it was like putting on another jacket or something, rather than being a kind of difficult process, you know, where he had to kind of that took place over months or years, you know, where he had to accept the reality of the system. I mean, it was interesting to see actually the contrast between the kind of rhetoric that he was espousing before Trump won and then after. So just before Trump won, he did an interview, I think with GB News, maybe, where he said, look, mass deportation will never happen in the UK. It's impossible. We just can't do it. You know, you can't get rid of millions of people. You just can't do it. Won't happen. Would take decades. Not even going to talk about it. And then not long after Trump was elected, he went, I think, on Winston Marshall's podcast and said, oh, yeah, we're going to deport at least 1.5 million people. And that was just because Donald Trump had won a landslide victory off the back of saying, we're going to deport 20 million people. You know, suddenly it seems possible. So I think what we've seen with Farage is that actually he doesn't have the resolve maybe that we thought he did. And actually, perhaps it's worth looking also actually at the way that he behaved around the referendum. So I think famously on the night of the referendum, he just said, oh, yeah, we're not going to win, and disappeared, basically. And then I think he was sort of woken up in the morning and told, actually, Nigel, we're leaving the European Union. You know, I think so I think possibly he doesn't possess the self-belief that somebody like Donald Trump possesses, but I think nevertheless he can probably be led, and I think that that's why the American example is so important. You know, I think if Donald Trump can make mass deportation work, if Donald Trump can show that actually, you know, you can have a genuinely popular platform off the basis of fundamental immigration reform, fundamental political change, etc., then maybe Nigel Farage will take some of that on board and actually start to put that forward as the reform platform as well. But yeah, it's not been encouraging at all. I mean, it's, you know, he's as close to being prime minister as he's ever been, or closer than he's ever been, and yet he just seems like an alternative conservative rather than something different, you know.
But this comes back to our conversation about the dissident right Christian alliance, because it seems to me that what Farage is definitely missing is some great civilizational narrative that he can refer to. You know, it seems to me that his conception of recovering England, recovering a sense of home, like this is the common possession of the English people, right? This landscape, this is our home. You know, I mean, the closest thing he has to that is, I don't know, wearing tweed jackets occasionally and drinking real ale. And well, you
British,
know, okay,
it's British values, isn't it? It's British values. Yeah. That's what they always say. It's
actually, this is the problem. You know, Gordon Brown used to go around constantly saying Britain is about values, not institutions. And actually, that is the perfect antithesis of what it's about. England was always about these received ancient institutions and a way of life, not about abstractions. And so I wonder whether what Farage needs is basically a J.D. Vance. He needs someone who actually is kind of been formed in the crucible of the current discussions about what our civilizational crisis is and how we might get out of it, and can tell a story to the people. Tell a story about who we are and where we're going to go and what our destiny is. What our, if you don't mind me using the kind of theological term, like what the providential role of this nation is. That's. But maybe I'm being a bit romantic about things. I don't know.
No, I think that kind of providential idea of English, British, and then later British nationhood and identity. That goes back to the Venerable Bede. We're talking about the 8th century that was being talked about. The Anglo-Saxons as the new Israel. That was Bede, in 725 or whatever. There does need to be something like that. There needs to be a fuller sense of English British identity than British values. That's what, like you say, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May. That's been part of the problem. It's not the solution. It's part of the problem, is watering down British English identity to a series of abstractions that anybody in the world can claim allegiance to: fair play, tolerance. It's
diversity.
It's absolutely devoid of content, and it's devoid of content for a reason, because it's intended precisely actually to justify the kind of processes that have destroyed traditional British institutions, and in doing so destroyed Britain.
Well, I'm aware that your time is precious. So, is there any final thought you'd like to share with us before we end this interesting conversation?
No. Look, it was fantastic to speak to you. I didn't anticipate going so in depth on Christianity and the Reformation, that kind of stuff, because it's not really stuff that I've talked about in depth for quite some time, really. I finished my PhD in 2018 and took a rather radically different course since then. But no, it's great, and I do genuinely think that that these are issues that we actually really do have to grapple with if we're really going to talk seriously about the crisis that we're in, and actually find something practicable to do about it. So, it's been fascinating.
We didn't get to talk about diet or about treatment of animals or any of the things that we're going to have you on again, because there are.
I'd love to. Yeah, we should.
We absolutely should.
It'll be really interesting.